"You must be new here," the woman said with a perfectly manicured hand extended toward me. "I'm Vanessa, Gregory's wife." I smiled politely and reached out to shake her hand, but before I could introduce myself, my daughter-in-law Natalie swept in, champagne flute in hand. "Oh, this is just Eleanor," she said with a dismissive wave. "She helps keep the house running. Eleanor, would you mind checking if the caterers need anything in the kitchen?" Vanessa's eyes flickered with confusion as she glanced between us. But Natalie had already turned away, guiding her toward the other guests gathered in the grand living room, my living room, where crystal chandeliers that had belonged to my grandmother sparkled above them. I stood there, invisible in plain sight, in the home that had been in my family for 4 generations, the deed still bearing my name alone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I never intended to become a footnote in my own life. My name is Eleanor Matthews, and for 62 years I lived with the quiet certainty that kindness and sacrifice would be recognized, if not immediately, then eventually. I built my existence around this belief that giving without expectation would somehow be rewarded with appreciation. It took me 6 decades to discover how dangerously naive that assumption was. My journey began in Willow Creek, a small town nestled between rolling hills and sprawling farmland, where my grandfather had built our family home in 1923, a stately Victorian with wraparound porches and secret reading nooks tucked into unexpected corners. I grew up wandering its halls, tracing the intricate woodwork with my fingertips and listening to the stories my father told about each room. "This house has a soul," he'd say. "It remembers everyone who has loved it." When my parents passed, away within months of each other, my father from cancer and my mother from what the doctor gently called a broken heart, the house came to me, their only child. I was 32 then, already married to Richard, with our son Michael just learning to walk. Richard had a promising career as an architect, and we filled that house with laughter, dinner parties, and the comfortable chaos of family life. Then came the accident. A rainy night, a slick road, a driver who'd had 1 drink too many. I became a widow at 43, with a 13-year-old son who suddenly had to become the man of the house far too early. The insurance money kept us afloat while I transitioned from part-time work at the local library to a full-time position. Evenings and weekends, I took additional work transcribing medical records from home. We weren't wealthy, but we had enough. And, most importantly, we had our home, fully paid off, a sanctuary in an uncertain world. I poured everything into Michael after Richard died. My hopes, my dreams, my energy. Perhaps too much. Looking back, I recognize the warning signs I chose to ignore. The way he expected his laundry done just so, meals prepared to his preferences, his room maintained while he focused on more important things like his studies and social life. I told myself I was supporting his bright future, not creating a young man who saw domestic labor as something that happened invisibly around him. When Michael brought Natalie home from graduate school, I was thrilled. She was beautiful, ambitious, and articulate. Everything I'd hoped my son would find. Her background was more privileged than ours. Her father was a successful surgeon, her mother a former beauty queen who'd never worked outside the home. I noticed how Natalie's eyes widened when she first saw our house, taking in the original hardwood floors, the hand-carved banister, the stained glass accents that caught the afternoon light. "It's like something from a movie," she'd whispered, and I felt a surge of pride. Our home might not have had the contemporary luxuries of her parents' modern mansion, but it had character, history, and heart. The wedding was lavish. Her parents insisted on covering most expenses, and afterward, the young couple moved to the city, where both had secured promising positions at prestigious firms. I continued my quiet life in Willow Creek, working at the library, tending to my garden, and joining a watercolor class I'd always been too busy to take while raising Michael. 3 years later, when they announced they were expecting their first child, everything changed. The city was no place to raise a family, they decided. Housing prices in good school districts were astronomical. Daycare costs would eat up a significant portion of one's salary. "Mom," Michael said during a Sunday phone call, "we've been thinking, that house is so big for just you. You rattle around in it all by yourself." I'd felt a prickle of unease. "I like having space for my projects," I said carefully, "and the garden keeps me busy." "But wouldn't it make more sense for us to move in? You could help with the baby and we'd save on childcare. Plus, we could help with maintenance and updates." The house needs. The conversation continued in that vein for weeks. I raised concerns. They countered them. I suggested they take the east wing with its separate entrance. They pointed out the master suite had the updated bathroom they're real. Estate agent said was essential for maintaining property value. Eventually, worn down by persistence and my own desire to be close to my grandchild, I agreed. "Just until you find the right place to buy," I stipulated. "Of course," Michael assured me. 2 years, tops. I moved into the smaller bedroom that had once been Michael's, converting the adjacent sitting room into a makeshift studio for my watercolors. They took over the master suite, and Natalie immediately began refreshing the house with her interior design vision. Family photos disappeared from the main areas, replaced by abstract art pieces from galleries I'd never heard of. My comfortable, worn furniture was relegated to the basement, swapped for sleek, minimalist pieces that Natalie assured everyone were investment pieces. I said nothing. After all, wasn't it natural for a young couple to want to make a space their own? I focused instead on preparing for my grandchild, converting my old sewing room into a nursery filled with the same rocking chair where I'd nursed. Michael, the bookshelf Richard had built, filled now with new copies of the same stories I'd read to our son. Charlotte arrived on a rainy spring morning, beautiful and perfect with Michael's chin and Natalie's eyes. I waited by the phone for the call to come to the hospital, but it never came. Instead, I learned of her birth through a neighbor who'd seen Michael's announcement on social media. When I called, Michael sounded distracted. "Sorry, Mom. Things got crazy. You can come tomorrow during visiting hours. Natalie's parents are here now." I arrived the next day with a basket of homemade muffins, herbal teas for lactation support, and a hand-knitted blanket I'd been working on for months. Natalie's mother, Vivian, was arranging flowers when I entered, expensive blooms from the high-end florist in the city. "Eleanor, there you are." Vivian's greeting was friendly but distant, the same tone one might use with a familiar postal worker. Natalie was just saying she hoped you'd bring some of your healing tea. Apparently, it's the one thing she's been craving. I smiled, pleased to be needed, and moved toward Natalie, who was propped up in bed with Charlotte nestled against her chest. "She's beautiful," I whispered, tears springing to my eyes. "Thanks," Natalie said, not looking up. "Can you wash your hands before you touch anything? Hospital germs, you know." I nodded and headed to the sink, passing Michael, who was deeply engaged with his phone. He didn't look up. "I brought some of those lemon poppy seed muffins you like," I said. "Oh, thanks. Vivian already ordered breakfast from that French place downtown. Maybe tomorrow." After 30 awkward minutes of trying to engage with a room full of people who seemed to look through me, I left my gifts and returned home to prepare for their return. I scrubbed the house from top to bottom, stocked the refrigerator with easy meals, and made sure everything was perfect for the new parents and their precious cargo. They arrived 4 days later, Vivian and her husband Gerald in tow. "We'll stay for the first week," Vivian announced, setting her designer luggage in the Yao guest room, my old studio, hastily rearranged to accommodate them. Just until they find their rhythm. 1 week turned into 3. Gerald returned to his practice after the first weekend, but Vivian remained, directing the household as if she'd been appointed its manager. She spoke about me in the third person, even when I was present. Eleanor likes to cook the old-fashioned way, or Eleanor hasn't quite caught up with modern childcare approaches. I retreated further into the background of my own home, finding small ways to be useful without intruding on their new family dynamic. I did laundry in the early mornings before anyone else was awake. I prepared meals and left them in covered dishes that could be reheated whenever they were wanted. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I tended the garden that had always been my sanctuary, bringing in fresh flowers for rooms I was increasingly hesitant to enter. Vivian finally departed after a month, but by then patterns had been established. Natalie had learned to speak about me rather than to me, and Michael had grown comfortable with my invisibility. When Charlotte cried at night, I would hear them pacing the floors, shushing desperately, but they never knocked on my door for help, even though I lay awake, listening, willing them to ask. The morning after Vivian left, I came downstairs to find Natalie struggling with the coffee maker, dark circles under her eyes. Charlotte was fussing in her bouncer on the kitchen counter. "Here," I said, gently moving Natalie aside. "Let me." She stepped back without protest, running a hand through her unwashed hair. "She was up every hour," Natalie said, her voice cracking. "I don't know what I'm doing wrong." I wanted to tell her that nothing was wrong, that babies sometimes just have difficult nights, that this phase would pass like all the others. Instead, I focused on making the coffee, sensing that unsolicited advice would only widen the gap between us. "I could take her for a few hours this afternoon," I offered cautiously, "if you wanted to rest." Natalie stared at me as if I'd suggested something outlandish. "You'd do that?" "Of course," I said, pouring the freshly brewed coffee into her favorite mug. She's my granddaughter. That afternoon became a tentative new pattern. 3 times a week, I would take Charlotte for a few hours while Natalie napped or caught up on work emails. I never presumed, always waited to be asked, careful not to overstep the invisible boundaries that had been established. During these precious hours, I would sing to Charlotte the same lullabies I'd sung to Michael, show her the garden, point out butterflies and hummingbirds, tell her stories about her father as a little boy. For a few weeks, things improved. Natalie seemed less tense. Michael occasionally joined us for dinner rather than eating in front of his laptop, and I began to hope that we might find a comfortable equilibrium. Then came the day of the first garden club meeting. Willow Creek's Garden Society was prestigious in our small town. Membership limited to those with significant horticultural knowledge and exceptional gardens. I'd been a member for 15 years, serving twice as president. Our monthly meetings rotated among members' homes, and May was traditionally my month to host. I mentioned this to Natalie over breakfast, 3 weeks before the scheduled date. "It's about 20 people," I explained. "They come for tea, tour the garden, and then we have our meeting. I usually serve scones and finger sandwiches." Natalie's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "This May, as in 3 weeks from now?" I nodded. "It's always the third Thursday. I've hosted every May since I joined." She set her fork down carefully. "Eleanor, we've already scheduled Charlotte's baptism celebration for that weekend. The garden needs to be perfect for the photographer." "Oh," I said, momentarily thrown. "I didn't realize." "When did you decide this?" "Weeks ago," she said, her tone suggesting I should have somehow known. "We sent the invitations last Monday. Didn't you see the sample on the hall table?" I hadn't, but I didn't say so. A sample invitation left on a side table without comment hardly constituted proper notification. "I see," I said carefully. "Well, I've already confirmed with the Garden Society. Perhaps we could work around both events. My meeting would be over by 3, and if the baptism is Sunday, the garden." "Party is Saturday," Natalie interrupted, "and we need Friday to set up. The event planner is bringing in special tables, a tent for the side lawn, and custom floral arrangements." We can't have 20 gardening enthusiasts trampling through the day before. Trampling? I echoed, stung. These are careful gardeners who appreciate— Mom, Michael interjected, entering the kitchen with his omnipresent laptop. It's Charlotte's baptism. Surely your garden club can skip a month or meet somewhere else. I looked between them, suddenly understanding that in their minds, my decades-long commitment held no weight compared to their hastily planned celebration. My garden, the one I had cultivated for 30 years, the one that had been featured twice in regional gardening magazines, was merely a backdrop for their event. I'll see what I can arrange, I said quietly, rising from the table. I spent the morning making apologetic calls to Garden Society members, explaining the last-minute change. Most were understanding, though a few expressed surprise that I hadn't known about my own granddaughter's baptism celebration in time to avoid the conflict. One particularly direct friend, Margaret, asked pointedly, "Eleanor, is everything all right? This isn't like you." "Everything's fine," I assured her automatically. "Just a miscommunication." But as I hung up, I wondered if that were true. A miscommunication implied a failed attempt at communication. This felt more like I simply wasn't being considered at all. The baptism celebration was lavish by local standards. Natalie had hired a party planner from the city who transformed my garden with white tents, elaborate floral arrangements that oddly duplicated flowers already blooming in the beds, and catering from a trendy restaurant that specialized in deconstructed classics, which seemed to mean familiar foods made unnecessarily complicated. I wore a blue dress I'd purchased specially for the occasion, styled my hair with more care than usual, and applied light makeup. When I came downstairs, ready to help with last-minute preparations, I found the house already filled with strangers setting up. "Excuse me," said a young man balancing a tray of champagne flutes. "The family entrance is through the side door. This area is being prepped for guests." "I am family," I said, my cheeks warming. "I'm Charlotte's grandmother. This is my home." He blinked, confused. "Oh, sorry. Mrs. Crawford described you differently." "Mrs. Crawford? Natalie. She had described me to the staff, and clearly not as the lady of the house. The party itself was a blur of unfamiliar faces, colleagues of Michael and Natalie's, friends from their city life, and Vivian's extensive social circle. I recognized a few neighbors, but most were strangers to me. I moved through my own garden, like a visitor, careful not to touch the rented furniture or disrupt the carefully orchestrated flow planned by the event coordinator. Midway through the afternoon, I found myself near a group of Natalie's friends, partially hidden from their view by one of the large floral arrangements. "The house is amazing," one woman was saying. "Such character. I can't believe they got it for such a steal." "Well, family property," another replied. "Natalie said they're basically house-sitting while his mother transitions to retirement. Eventually, they'll do a full renovation. That kitchen is straight out of the 1990s. At least they have live-in help with the baby," a third added. "That's got to be worth the outdated bathrooms." I froze, my champagne glass halfway to my lips. Live-in help? Is that how Natalie described me to her friends? "Speaking of which," the first woman lowered her voice. "Is that her over there? In the blue dress? I thought she'd be older somehow." "No, that's Michael's mother," the second woman corrected. "The help is more, you know, practical looking." I set my barely touched champagne on a nearby table and walked away, my face burning with humiliation. I needed space, air that wasn't perfumed with flowers cut from someone else's garden. I made my way to the far corner of the property, to the old oak tree where Richard and I had once hung a swing for Michael. The swing was long gone, the branch that had held it now supporting an elaborate bird feeder Natalie had ordered from. A catalog. I leaned against the rough bark, closing my eyes and breathing deeply. The music and chatter from the party seemed distant here, allowing me a moment to collect myself. "Grandma?" I turned to find Charlotte's nanny, Lisa, approaching with my granddaughter in her arms. At 10 months, Charlotte was a sunbeam, all golden curls and bright eyes, dressed today in an heirloom christening gown that had been mine, then Michael's. It was the one tradition Natalie had embraced after discovering the gown's provenance made for a charming anecdote. "Someone's looking for you," Lisa said with a gentle smile, transferring Charlotte to my arms. "She's been fussy with all the strangers wanting to hold her." Charlotte immediately settled against my shoulder, her small hand patting my cheek in a gesture that never failed to melt my heart. "Thank you," I said to Lisa, genuinely grateful for this moment of connection amid a day of feeling adrift. Lisa hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Mrs. Matthews, I just wanted to say, well, the way they—" She trailed off, seemingly unsure how to continue without overstepping. "It's all right," I assured her, understanding what she couldn't quite articulate. "I know." She nodded, relief and something like respect in her eyes. "I'll tell them. She's with you. Take your time." As Lisa walked away, I turned my attention fully to Charlotte, whose eyes were growing heavy despite the party's ambient noise. I began to hum softly, swaying in the gentle rhythm that had soothed babies since time immemorial. Charlotte's weight in my arms, her complete trust and vulnerability, crystallized something within me. This child deserved to know her heritage, to understand the love and history woven into the fabric of this home. She deserved a grandmother who commanded respect, not one who had been relegated to the margins of her own life. I stood beneath the oak tree for nearly an hour, holding my sleeping granddaughter and coming to decisions that had been forming unconsciously for months. When I finally returned to the party, my steps were lighter, my posture straighter. Something had shifted within me, a reclamation of myself that felt both terrifying and necessary. The party continued around me, but I moved through it differently now. I introduced myself directly to guests who looked confused about my role. I corrected misconceptions gently but firmly. "Actually, this garden has been my project for 30 years," or "This was my grandmother's silver service. It's been in the family for generations." Michael noticed the change immediately, watching me with a mixture of confusion and wariness as I navigated the social currents of the event with newfound assertiveness. Natalie, busy playing the perfect hostess, seemed oblivious until late in the evening when I overheard her explaining the history of the house to a group of admiring guests. "The original woodwork is all being restored next spring," she was saying confidently. "We found a craftsman who specializes in Victorian-era homes." This was news to me. No such plans had been discussed, and any significant alterations to the home's structure would require not only considerable expense, but my approval as the legal owner. I approached the group, Charlotte once again in my arms, after having rescued her from an overly enthusiastic great-aunt of Natalie's. "That sounds like quite an undertaking," I said pleasantly, joining the conversation. "I wasn't aware we'd made any decisions about restoration work." Natalie's smile froze. "Eleanor, there you are. I was just telling the Hendersons about our plans for the house." "Our plans?" I echoed, maintaining my pleasant tone. "I don't recall discussing any restoration work." An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. The man Natalie had been addressing, presumably Mr. Henderson, cleared his throat awkwardly. "The woodwork is certainly exceptional," he offered. "Original to the house?" "Yes," I replied, smiling genuinely now. "My grandfather commissioned it when the house was built in 1923. He was quite particular about the craftsmanship." "Your grandfather?" Mrs. Henderson looked between Natalie and me, confusion evident. "Yes," I said simply. "This house has been in my family for 4 generations. I grew up here, raised Michael here, and now I'm pleased to share it with him and his family." I bounced Charlotte gently as she began to stir, though any restoration decisions would naturally require my input, as I still own the property. The silence that followed was deafening. Natalie's face had drained of color, while the Hendersons looked increasingly uncomfortable. "If you'll excuse us," I continued smoothly, "I think this little one needs a quieter environment. It was lovely meeting you both." I walked away, Charlotte, snuggled against my shoulder, feeling Natalie's gaze burning into my back. I had broken the unspoken rules of our arrangement, had asserted myself as the homeowner rather than the helpful grandmother in the background. I knew there would be consequences, but in that moment, cradling my granddaughter and walking with purpose through the home that had sheltered generations of my family, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. That night, after the last guest had departed and the catering staff had packed away their equipment, I sat alone on the back porch, watching fireflies rise from the garden as dusk deepened into night. The door opened behind me, and Michael stepped out, 2 glasses of wine in hand. He offered one to me without a word, then took a seat in the adjacent chair. We sat in silence for several minutes, sipping our wine and listening to the chorus of cicadas emerging with the darkness. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice carefully neutral. "Natalie's upset." "I imagine she is," I replied, equally measured. "You embarrassed her in front of her friends." I turned to look at him directly. "By stating a fact, that this is my house?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture so reminiscent of his father that my heart ached. "Mom, we had an understanding. You said we could make this our home." "I said you could live here," I corrected gently. "There's a difference." "Semantics," he muttered, taking a larger sip of his wine. "Not to me," I said. "And apparently not to Natalie either, given how she describes me to others." His gaze shifted away from mine. "She doesn't mean anything by it. It's just easier. Sometimes to..." "To what?" I interrupted, my voice still soft but now edged with steel. "To pretend I'm the hired help? To act as if I'm a tenant in my own home? To make plans for major renovations without even mentioning them to me?" He had the grace to look ashamed at the last point. "Those are just ideas, not concrete plans. Natalie gets excited about design possibilities. And yet she presented them as decisions already made," I noted, "to people who might reasonably be expected to remember such claims later." Michael was silent for a long moment, swirling the remaining wine in his glass. "What do you want, Mom? For us to leave?" The question hung in the night air between us, weighted with implications. Did I want them to leave? The answer was complicated. I wanted my home back, yes, but I also wanted my family close. I wanted to watch Charlotte grow, to be part of her daily life. I wanted Michael to understand the difference between sharing a home and surrendering it entirely. "I want respect," I said finally. "I want acknowledgement of my place in this home and in your lives. I want to stop feeling like an intruder in the house I've maintained for decades." Michael's expression softened slightly. "You know I respect you, Mom." "Do I?" I asked quietly. "When was the last time you corrected someone who misunderstood my role here? When did you last acknowledge my contributions to this household? When have you ever said no to Natalie when her wishes directly conflicted with mine?" He had no answer for these questions, and we both knew it. "I don't want you to leave," I continued after a moment. "But things need to change. I need to reclaim my place in my own home." "What does that mean exactly?" he asked, wariness creeping back into his tone. "It means I'll be moving back into the master bedroom," I said simply. "It means family, photographs returned to the main living areas. It means no renovation decisions without my explicit approval. And it means you and Natalie need to clarify my role to your friends and colleagues." Michael stared at me as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. "The master bedroom? Mom, we've completely renovated that bathroom. All our things are there. Natalie has her dressing room set up." And I had my life established before you moved in, I reminded him. I made accommodations then. Now it's your turn. He stood abruptly, setting his wine glass down with more force than necessary. This isn't fair. We've built our lives around this arrangement. An arrangement that was supposed to be temporary, I pointed out. 2 years, you said. We're approaching 3, with no mention of looking for your own place. Because it's been working, he exclaimed, then immediately lowered his voice, glancing toward the house where Charlotte was sleeping. At least I thought it was. It was working for you and Natalie, I said sadly. But I've become invisible in my own home, Michael. Surely you can see that. He ran both hands through his hair now, frustration radiating from him. I need to talk to Natalie about this. She's not going to accept— This isn't a negotiation, I interrupted, my voice gentle but firm. This is me informing you of changes that will be happening in my home. Natalie's acceptance isn't required, though it would certainly make things more pleasant for everyone. Michael stared at me for a long moment, as if seeing me clearly for the first time in years. When did you get so assertive? I suggested, a small smile playing at my lips. I've always been strong, Michael. I raised you alone while working full-time after your father died. I maintained this house through ice storms and roof leaks and plumbing disasters. I put you through college without a penny of debt. I paused. Kindness isn't weakness. I've just finally learned that it can't be taken for granted. He had no response to this, and after another moment of tense silence, he turned and went, back into the house, leaving me alone with the fireflies and my thoughts. I knew the conversation wasn't over, that this was merely the opening salvo in what would likely be a difficult transition. Natalie would resist, Michael would be caught. In the middle, and there would be uncomfortable days ahead. But sitting there in the gathering darkness, I felt lighter than I had in years. I had begun to reclaim my voice, my space, my identity beyond the roles of mother and grandmother. The house behind me creaked and settled, as it had done every night for nearly a century. 4 generations of my family had listened to those same comfortable sounds, had watched fireflies rise from this same garden. I was merely the current custodian of a legacy that would eventually pass to Michael, then to Charlotte. But not yet. Not while I still had life to live, contributions to make, and dignity to reclaim. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, tears perhaps, possibly even ultimatums. But tonight, under a canopy of emerging stars, I allowed myself to feel the quiet triumph of a woman who had finally remembered her own worth. 6 months after Charlotte's birth, Natalie decided to host a garden party to introduce Charlotte properly to their social circle, colleagues from their firms, friends from graduate school, and neighbors who had yet to meet the newest resident of our home. I spent days preparing the garden, bringing my most prized roses to their peak, trimming the hedges into perfect lines, and arranging seating areas under the shade of the old maple trees. I baked for 2 days straight, my famous lavender shortbread, raspberry tarts with fresh berries from our bushes, and savory finger sandwiches that had been the highlight of every gathering I'd hosted in my years as a young wife and mother. The morning of the party, Natalie emerged from her room and surveyed my work with a frown. "Mom Matthews," she said. Never Eleanor, never Mom. Always this formal hybrid that kept me at arm's length. I forgot to mention that I've hired caterers. They'll need full access to the kitchen from noon onwards. "Oh," I said, looking at the cooling racks filled with my baking efforts. "I've already prepared quite a bit." She glanced at the trays and smiled tightly. "That's so sweet, but we're going for a specific aesthetic. Modern, clean lines, nothing too homespun. Maybe you could take those to your library colleagues?" I nodded mutely and began packing away my contributions as she continued issuing directives about where the caterers should set up and how the bar should be arranged on the patio. My patio. My home. The party itself was a blur of unfamiliar faces, expensive summer dresses, and conversations that hushed when I approached. I had dressed carefully in a floral dress I'd purchased specifically for the occasion, styled my silver hair in a neat bob, and even applied makeup, something I rarely bothered with in my day-to-day life. I was arranging some fallen rose petals in a decorative bowl when I overheard Natalie speaking to a group of her friends on the terrace. "The house is a total project," she was saying with a dramatic sigh. "So much potential, but stuck in a serious time warp. We're planning a complete renovation once Mom Matthews decides if she's staying or moving to that senior community in town." I froze, my hand suspended over the bowl. Senior community? This was the first I'd heard of any such plan. "But the gardens are gorgeous," one of her friends remarked. "Oh, that's all, Eleanor," Natalie said with a dismissive wave. "Gardening keeps her busy, gives her purpose, you know. At her age, it's important to have hobbies." I was 62, not 92. I worked full-time at the library, served on 2 community boards, and took advanced watercolor classes at the community college. I had purpose well beyond deadheading roses. As I stood there, processing this dismissal of my entire existence, a woman I'd never met approached Natalie's circle. "This home is simply magnificent," she gushed. "The woodwork alone must be irreplaceable today." Natalie beamed. "Thank you. It's been in Michael's family for generations. Such a responsibility to maintain these historic properties, but we feel it's important to preserve them." Michael's family. Not my family. Not my home that I had preserved, maintained, and loved through decades of both joy and heartbreak. I felt something shift inside me, a tectonic plate of self-perception slowly grinding against the weight of years of accommodation. I straightened my shoulders and stepped forward, intending to politely correct this misrepresentation, when I was intercepted by a caterer with a question about where to find additional ice. By the time I'd directed him to the freezer in the backyard garage, Natalie's group had dispersed. I found myself standing alone by the rose garden my grandmother had planted, feeling like a ghost in my own life story. The following week, Natalie's parents came for another extended visit. Vivian arrived, with 3 enormous suitcases, as if preparing for a month-long stay rather than the long weekend Michael had mentioned. Gerald, her husband, looked apologetic as he carried them into the guest room, my former painting studio, now permanently converted to accommodate their frequent visits. "Eleanor?" Vivian greeted me with air kisses near my cheeks. "The garden? Looks divine. You must spend hours out there." "I enjoy it," I replied simply, helping Gerald with the smaller bags. "How long will you be staying this time?" Vivian waved a manicured hand vaguely. "Oh, just until things settle. Natalie's overwhelmed with the new project at work, and Charlotte's entering that difficult crawling stage. She needs her mother." I nodded as if this explained the mountain of luggage, though in reality, Natalie had mentioned nothing about work stress or needing extra help with Charlotte. In fact, she'd recently been boasting about how well she was managing to have it all: career, motherhood, social life, though her version of all was made possible largely by my constant, unacknowledged support. That evening, I prepared a welcome dinner: roast chicken with herbs from the garden, summer vegetables from the local farmer's market, and a lemon tart that had been Gerald's favorite during previous visits. I set the table with care, using the hand-embroidered linen tablecloth that had been my mother's, and the simple pottery dishes that Richard and I had collected during our travels. At precisely 6, I called everyone to the table. Natalie appeared first, Charlotte on her hip. "Oh," she said, surveying the table. "I forgot to mention, Daddy made reservations at Riverstone for 7. Their new chef is apparently revolutionary. We'll just grab something quick here for Charlotte before we go." I stood by the table, the steam still rising from the perfectly roasted chicken. "I see. Will you be long? I could keep the food warm." "Don't wait up," Vivian said, sweeping into the room in a cloud of expensive perfume. "These tasting menus can go for hours. We might stop for drinks afterward with the Hendersons. They're joining us. Michael entered last, already dressed for dinner out in a tailored blazer I hadn't seen before. His eyes flickered to the table, then away. Sorry. Mom, I thought Natalie told you about the reservations. No matter, I said, forcing a smile. More leftovers for tomorrow. They left in a flurry of activity, last-minute primping, calls to confirm the reservation, and instructions for Charlotte's bedtime routine, though I had been putting her to bed 3 nights a week since she was born. The front door closed behind them, and silence fell over the house, broken only by Charlotte's soft babbling as she played with a wooden spoon on the kitchen floor. I looked at the elaborate meal, now cooling on the table, and felt a wave of something beyond hurt, a clarifying anger that burned away the fog of accommodation I'd been living in. Well, Charlotte, I said, lifting her into my arms, looks like it's just you and me tonight. How about we have a picnic in the garden? I packed some of the food into a basket, grabbed a quilt from the hall closet, and took my granddaughter outside into the soft evening light. We sat under the old maple tree, Charlotte delightedly squishing peas between her fingers while I fed her small bites of chicken. The simple pleasure of her company, her innocent joy in discovering the texture of grass beneath the quilt, the way she studied a passing butterfly with intense concentration. These moments were precious beyond measure. But as the twilight deepened into dusk, I found myself contemplating the contrast between this quiet evening and the elaborate dinner my family was enjoying without me. Not even a proper invitation or explanation, just an assumption that my plans were flexible, my efforts disposable, my presence optional. The next morning, I woke early as usual, starting coffee and preparing to make breakfast before heading to my shift at the library. Vivian appeared in the kitchen doorway as I was slicing fruit, already dressed in designer athleisure wear, her face perfectly made up despite the early hour. Eleanor, I hope you don't mind, but I've taken the liberty of rearranging the kitchen. Cabinets, she announced, helping herself to coffee. The workflow was terribly inefficient. Natalie struggles to find anything when she's trying to prepare Charlotte's meals. I set down my knife carefully. The cabinets have been organized, that way for 30 years. Vivian waved dismissively. Exactly my point. So outdated. Now all the baby things are together, and I've created a section for those organic superfoods Natalie likes. Much more logical. I wanted to point out that Natalie rarely prepared meals at all, let alone Charlotte's, which were usually handled by me or the part-time nanny they'd hired for days when I worked at the library. Instead, I simply asked, "Where did you put my ceramic mixing bowls? The blue ones?" "Oh, those old things?" Vivian looked vaguely uncomfortable. "They were chipped, dear. I put them in that donation box in the garage. Made room for the new Smeg appliances Michael ordered for Natalie's birthday. They arrive next Tuesday. My grandmother's mixing bowls, handcrafted by a local potter in the 1940s, used to make countless birthday cakes, holiday cookies, and Sunday morning pancakes, discarded without consultation. And new appliances I'd heard nothing about, ordered. For a kitchen that wasn't theirs to renovate." "I see," I said, my voice steady despite the hollow feeling expanding in my chest. "And my spice rack?" "Cluttered up the counter," Vivian replied briskly. "Those little jars looked so messy. I condensed what I could into matching containers in the pantry. Much more streamlined. My carefully cultivated collection of herbs and spices, many grown and dried from my own garden, special blends I'd perfected over decades, condensed and repackaged without labels, their unique properties and purposes now indistinguishable. I should have been angry. Perhaps a younger version of myself would have been. Instead, I felt a strange calm descend, as if I were observing the scene from a distance. "Thank you for your efforts," I said politely, gathering my purse and car keys. "I need to leave for work now. Will you be here when Charlotte wakes up, or should I ask Lisa to come early?" Vivian looked surprised by my mild reaction. Oh, I'll handle Charlotte this morning. Natalie needs her rest after last night. I nodded and left without another word, driving to the library on autopilot, my thoughts circling around the quiet, dismantling of my life that was happening within my own home. By the time I arrived at work, I had made a decision. During my lunch break, I called Douglas Freeman, the attorney who had handled Richard's estate and had been managing my affairs for nearly 20 years. "Eleanor?" He greeted me warmly. "This is an unexpected pleasure. How are you?" "I need your advice, Douglas," I said, getting straight to the point. "It's about the house." I explained the situation, Michael and Natalie's increasingly proprietary attitude toward my home, the renovations being planned without my input, the gradual erasure of my presence and authority within my own space. Douglas listened without interruption, his silence on the other end of the line somehow reassuring. "I see," he said when I'd finished. "And what outcome are you hoping for, Eleanor?" It was a good question, one I hadn't fully articulated even to myself. "I don't want to evict my son and his family," I said after a moment's reflection. "But I need to reassert my ownership and establish boundaries. I need them to understand that their current behavior is untenable." "Legally, the situation is straightforward," Douglas replied. "The house is solely in your name. You've maintained it, paid taxes on it, and covered all related expenses since Richard's death. Your son has no claim to the property, regardless of any improvements they've made without your explicit consent." "And practically speaking?" I asked, knowing Douglas well enough to recognize when he was leading up to a more nuanced perspective. He sighed. "Practically speaking, family dynamics are rarely solved through legal channels alone. Have you had a direct conversation with Michael about your concerns?" "Not yet," I admitted. "Things have evolved so gradually that I'm only now recognizing the full pattern." "Then that's your first step," he advised. "Be clear about your boundaries and expectations. Document any agreements you reach. If they're resistant or dismissive, we can discuss more formal measures." I thanked him and promised to keep him updated. As I ended the call, my colleague Margaret appeared in the doorway of the break room, concern evident on her face. "Everything all right, Eleanor? You look troubled." Margaret had been my friend since we both started at the library 20 years earlier. She was one of the few people who knew the full history of my home and family, who had watched Michael grow from a grieving teenager into the successful but increasingly distant adult he'd become. "Just sorting out some family matters," I said, attempting a reassuring smile. Margaret wasn't fooled. "Those in-laws of yours taking over again?" I hesitated, then decided honesty might be a relief. "They've rearranged my kitchen cabinets, discarded my grandmother's mixing bowls, and are planning renovations without consulting me." Margaret's eyes widened. "In your house? The house you own outright?" I nodded. "And you're calling a lawyer instead of changing the locks because..." Despite everything, I laughed. "Because they're still my family. Because my granddaughter is there." Margaret's expression softened. "Family doesn't treat you like an inconvenient houseguest, Eleanor. Or worse, like the help." Her words struck uncomfortably close to the feelings I'd been trying to articulate even to myself. "No," I agreed quietly. "They don't." That evening, I arrived home to find the house transformed yet again. While I'd been at work, Natalie and Vivian had rearranged the living room furniture, moving my reading chair from its place by the window to a dark corner and repositioning the sofa to face away from the fireplace toward the large television. They'd mounted on the wall, drilling into the original woodwork without consultation. "Don't you love it?" Natalie exclaimed when she saw me taking in the changes. "Mom had the most brilliant idea for maximizing the flow. Now we can see this TV from the kitchen, and that old chair isn't blocking the natural light." The old chair had been Richard's favorite, reupholstered by me after his death in fabric that complemented the room's original color scheme. The window it had been positioned near overlooked the garden, providing the perfect light for reading. and the view Richard had loved during his final months when illness had confined him mostly to home. "I see," I said, setting down my bag. "Where's Charlotte?" "Napping," Natalie replied, already turning her attention back to the magazine she'd been browsing. "Finally. She's been fussy all day." I nodded and headed upstairs, ostensibly to change out of my work clothes, but really seeking a moment of privacy to process yet another alteration to my home made without my input or consent. As I passed Charlotte's nursery, I heard not the deep breathing of a sleeping baby, but soft whimpering. I opened the door quietly to find my granddaughter standing in her crib, face tear-stained, reaching for me as soon as she saw me. "Hello, sweetheart," I murmured, lifting her into my arms. "Not sleeping after all, Charlotte buried her face against my neck, her small body still hiccuping with the aftermath of tears. She felt warm, too warm. I pressed my lips gently to her forehead, a grandmother's thermometer. "You're running a fever, little one," I said, softly, concern immediately pushing aside my earlier distress. "Let's get you comfortable." I carried her to my room, settling her on my bed while I dampened a soft cloth with cool water. As I tended to her, checking for other symptoms and making sure she was hydrated, I heard voices from downstairs. Michael had arrived home, and judging by the animated conversation, was being shown the living room's new arrangement. I texted him. "Charlotte has a fever. In my room with her now. Might need to call the pediatrician if it doesn't come down soon." Seconds later, I heard footsteps on the stairs, and Michael appeared in my doorway, concern etched on his face. "How high is her fever? Did you take her temperature?" I nodded toward the digital thermometer on my nightstand. 100. 2. Not dangerously high, but she's uncomfortable. How long has she been fussy? "I'm not sure," Michael admitted, sitting on the edge of the bed and stroking Charlotte's hair. "I was at work, and when I texted earlier, Mom said Natalie mentioned she was being difficult about nap time." "Difficult isn't the same as ill," I pointed out, keeping my voice neutral. "She probably needed to be checked on." Michael had the grace to look chagrined. "I'll go get the children's Tylenol." As he left, Natalie appeared, Vivian hovering behind her. "Is she really sick?" Natalie asked, making no move to enter the room or approach her daughter. "She was whining earlier, but I thought she was just overtired." "She has a fever," I confirmed, continuing to stroke Charlotte's back as she dozed fitfully against me. "Nothing serious yet, but we should monitor it." "Well, we have dinner reservations at 7, Natalie said, glancing at her watch. "The Prescotts are only in town for one night. I guess we'll have to cancel." "Or we could use that agency again," Vivian suggested. "The one with the overnight nurses, for emergencies." I looked up at them, momentarily speechless. Their child was sick, and their first thought was how to maintain their social plans rather than how to comfort her. "I'll stay with her," I said finally. "Cancel your reservations or don't. But Charlotte doesn't need a stranger tonight. She needs her family." Something in my tone must have conveyed more than my words, because Natalie's expression shifted from inconvenience to defensiveness. I wasn't suggesting leaving her with a stranger. The agency only employs qualified pediatric nurses. They're more equipped to handle illness than... She trailed off, perhaps realizing how the end of that sentence would sound. "Then her grandmother?" I finished for her. "I raised a child too, Natalie. I know what a fever looks like and how to manage it." Michael returned with the Tylenol, his expression making it clear he'd overheard at least part of the exchange. "Mom's right," he said, handing me the medicine and a small oral syringe. "Charlotte will be more comfortable with family tonight. You three go ahead to dinner. I'll stay home." Natalie looked genuinely surprised. "But the Prescotts are your clients too. This dinner has been planned for weeks." "They'll understand that my daughter comes first," Michael replied firmly. It was the first time in months I'd seen my son. Take a clear stance that prioritized family care over social or professional obligations. More significantly, it was the first time he'd openly chosen a position that aligned with mine, rather than Natalie's. The moment felt important, a small recalibration in a family dynamic that had become increasingly unbalanced. Natalie hesitated, clearly torn between pushing back and accepting the situation. Finally, she nodded. "All right, I'll make your excuses. Call me if anything changes." This last was directed at Michael, not me, despite the fact that I would be the one helping him care for Charlotte. After Natalie and Vivian departed, Michael and I settled into a quiet routine of caring for Charlotte. Her fever responded to the medication, and by 8 o'clock she was sleeping peacefully between us on my bed as we watched an old movie on my small television, the volume turned low. "I haven't done this in years," Michael commented during a quiet scene. "Just sat and watched a movie without checking email or taking calls." "Your father and I used to do this all the time," I replied, smiling at the memory. "Friday movie nights were sacred in this house." Michael was silent for a moment. "I remember," he said finally. "Dad would make that caramel popcorn, and you'd let me stay up late even on school nights if it was a special film you wanted me to see. You fell asleep during Casablanca 3 times before you finally made it all the way through," I recalled, laughing softly. "But I loved The Great Escape from the first viewing," he added. "Dad was so pleased about that." These shared memories felt precious, a reminder of the deep connection that still existed beneath the tensions of our current situation. As we reminisced, I realized how rarely we spoke of Richard anymore, how thoroughly Natalie's preference for forward momentum had erased the comfortable presence of the past in our daily lives. "Michael," I said carefully, "are you happy with how things are?" He glanced at me, then back at the screen. "What do you mean?" "This arrangement, the house, the way we're all living together but somehow not really connecting." He shifted. "Uncomfortably. It's complicated. With a baby, careers, everyone's adjusting." "It's been almost a year," I pointed out gently. "And lately, it feels less like adjustment and more like replacement." "Replacement?" he echoed, looking genuinely confused. "My things being moved or discarded? Decisions about the house being made without consulting me? Being introduced as the help rather than the homeowner, or even just your mother?" Michael's expression shifted from confusion to discomfort. "No one thinks of you as the help, Mom." "Don't they?" I asked quietly. "When was the last time Natalie consulted me before rearranging a room or planning a renovation? When did you last correct someone who misunderstood my role in this household?" He had no immediate answer, which was its own kind of response. "I'm not trying to create conflict," I continued, keeping my voice gentle. "But this is still my home, Michael. The home where I raised you, where your father and I built our life together. I've welcomed you and your family with open arms, but that doesn't mean I've signed over ownership, legally or emotionally." Charlotte stirred between us, and we both instinctively stilled, watching until she settled back into peaceful sleep. "What are you saying?" Michael finally asked, his voice barely audible. "Do you want us to move out?" The question hung in the air between us, weighted with implications. Did I want them to leave? The answer was complicated. I wanted my home back, yes, but I also wanted my family close. I wanted to watch Charlotte grow, to be part of her daily life. I wanted Michael to understand the difference between sharing a home and surrendering it entirely. "I want respect," I said finally. "I want acknowledgement of my place in this home and in your lives. I want to stop feeling like an intruder in the house I've maintained for decades." Michael's expression softened slightly. "You know I respect you, Mom." "Do I?" I asked quietly. "When was the last time you corrected someone who misunderstood my role here? When did you last acknowledge my contributions to this household? When have you ever said no to Natalie when her wishes directly conflicted with mine? He had no answer for these questions, and we both knew it. The movie played on, forgotten as we sat in thoughtful silence. Finally, Michael spoke again, his voice hesitant. What would making this right look like to you? It was a genuine question, I realized. Not defensive or dismissive, but a sincere attempt to understand my perspective. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. That perhaps our family dynamic could be rebalanced, not through confrontation, but through honest communication. It would start with recognition, I said carefully. Acknowledgement that this is still my home, where I have the final say in major decisions. It would mean consulting me before making changes, respecting my belongings and my memories, and correcting misperceptions about my role here. Michael nodded slowly. That seems reasonable. And, I continued, emboldened by his receptiveness, it would mean revisiting our original agreement. You said this living arrangement would be temporary. 2 years at most. We're approaching a year now, with no mention of looking for your own place. A shadow crossed his face. Real estate prices have only gotten worse, Mom, and with childcare costs. I understand the financial considerations, I assured him, and I'm not suggesting you move out immediately, but we need a clear plan, Michael, a timeline, and in the meantime, boundaries that respect my position in my own home. Charlotte whimpered in her sleep, and I automatically reached out to soothe her, my hand finding the exact spot on her back that always calmed her. As she settled again, Michael watched the interaction with a complex expression, part gratitude, part realization. You're really good with her, he said softly. Better than we are sometimes. I've had more practice, I replied, smiling, and I'm not juggling as many other demands as you and Natalie are. He nodded, then said with unexpected frankness, I've taken advantage of that. We both have. Expected you to pick up the slack, without properly acknowledging everything you do. The admission caught me by surprise, a moment of clarity I hadn't anticipated. Yes, I agreed simply. You have. I'll talk to Natalie, he said after a moment. About all of it. The boundaries, the timeline for finding our own place, the way we've been. Well, the way things have been. I reached across Charlotte to squeeze his hand briefly. Thank you. We returned our attention to the movie, though I suspect neither of us was fully following the plot anymore. When it ended, Michael carefully lifted Charlotte, still sleeping, and paused in the doorway of my room. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I am grateful for everything. I just forgot to say it for a while. After he left to put Charlotte in her crib, I sat on my bed processing the conversation. It had been more productive than I'd dared hope, but I was realistic enough to know that one heartfelt exchange wouldn't immediately transform our family dynamic. Natalie would resist, old patterns would reassert themselves, and change would come gradually, if at all. Still, as I prepared for bed, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, a sense of agency in my own life. I had named the problem, articulated my boundaries, and been heard by my son. It was a beginning. The next morning, I woke early, as usual, but instead of immediately starting breakfast preparations for the household, I took my coffee out to the garden. The June morning was already warm, promising another beautiful day. I settled into the old iron chair that had been my grandfather's, breathing in the scent of roses and contemplating the conversation ahead. Natalie and Vivian would be returning from their dinner with the Prescotts, likely late and possibly with headaches from the wine that inevitably flowed freely at such events. Michael would have been up with Charlotte if her fever had returned overnight. The timing wasn't ideal for a family meeting, but these discussions couldn't be postponed indefinitely. As the sun climbed higher, I heard movement in the kitchen, the coffee maker being refilled, cabinet doors opening and closing. I finished my coffee and made my way back inside, prepared for whatever the day might bring. Michael was at the counter, attempting to prepare oatmeal for Charlotte while simultaneously checking his phone. He looked up when I entered, offering a tired smile. "Morning, Mom." Her fever broke around midnight. She's still a little clingy, but definitely better. "I'm glad to hear it," I said, noting the mess he'd made of the simple breakfast preparation. "Would you like some help?" He looked relieved. "Please. I can never get the consistency right." I took over the oatmeal while he poured himself more coffee. "Did Natalie get home late?" I asked casually. "Around 1, he confirmed. The Prescotts wanted to check out that new cocktail place downtown after dinner." He hesitated, then added, "I talked to her a little about our conversation. Just the basics. She was too tired for details." I nodded, appreciating his honesty. "We should all sit down together. Today, if possible." Michael's expression grew more serious. "She has a hair appointment at 11, and then she and Mom are planning to look at some wallpaper samples for the downstairs powder room. More renovation plans I hadn't been consulted about." I kept my voice neutral. "The wallpaper can wait. This is important, Michael." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "You're right. I'll talk to her after breakfast." True to his word, by mid-morning, all 4 adults were seated in the living room, Michael and I on the sofa, Natalie in an armchair, and Vivian perched uncomfortably on the edge of Richard's chair that had been relegated to the corner. Charlotte was down for her morning nap, the baby monitor placed on the coffee table between us. "So," Natalie began, her tone making it clear she considered this meeting an inconvenience. "Michael says you have concerns about our living arrangement." I took a breath, reminding myself to remain calm and clear. "Yes, I do. When you all moved, and it was with the understanding that it would be temporary, a transitional period while you looked for your own home." "The market is impossible right now," Natalie interjected. "Surely you've seen the news about interest rates." "I'm aware of the economic challenges," I acknowledged, "but that doesn't change the fact that decisions are being made about my home without my input or consent. Rooms are being rearranged, my belongings moved or discarded, and renovations planned as if I have no say in the matter." Vivian shifted uncomfortably, but Natalie's expression remained impassive. "We're improving the property," she said, "modernizing outdated spaces, creating a more cohesive aesthetic. The value of the house has probably increased by 15%, just from the changes we've made to the master bath and kitchen." "That may be," I replied evenly. "But this isn't an investment property, Natalie. It's my home. A home with history and memories that matter to me, even if they don't align with current design trends." "So, what exactly are you saying?" Natalie asked, a defensive edge creeping into her voice. "That we should move out in the middle of a housing crisis, with a baby?" "I'm saying we need to establish clear boundaries and expectations," I clarified. "If you're going to continue living here, it needs to be with the understanding that this is still my home, where I have the final say in major decisions." Natalie glanced at Michael, clearly expecting him to intervene on her behalf. When he remained silent, her expression hardened. "I see. So after all we've done to improve this place, you're now laying down rules like we're tenants rather than family." "That's not fair," Michael said quietly but firmly. "Mom has been incredibly generous, letting us live here rent-free, helping with Charlotte daily, and accommodating our needs without complaint. The least we can do is respect her position as the homeowner." Natalie's eyebrows rose at this unexpected support from my son. "Whose side are you on, Michael?" "This isn't about sides," he replied. "It's about basic respect and consideration." Vivian, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up. "Perhaps we should all take a step back and consider what's best for Charlotte. Children need stability, a harmonious home environment." I couldn't agree more, I said, meeting her gaze steadily. Which is why I'm addressing these issues now, before resentments build to the point where harmony becomes impossible. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, sometimes heated, occasionally veering into tangential grievances, but gradually circling back to the central issues at hand. By the end, we had reached an uneasy accord. They would remain in the East Wing as originally agreed, while I would reclaim the master bedroom within the month. Family photographs would return to their places of honor throughout the main living areas. The garden would remain my domain. Most importantly, any renovations or significant changes to the house would require my explicit approval. As for the timeline for finding their own place, that remained more nebulous. Michael committed to beginning the search process again by Charlotte's first birthday, with a goal of moving before she turned 2. It wasn't as definitive as I might have wished, but it was a start. An acknowledgement that this arrangement wasn't permanent, that eventually they would establish their own household. As our meeting concluded, Natalie stood abruptly. If that's all, I need to reschedule my hair appointment. Her tone made it clear she considered the entire discussion an imposition, but she didn't openly challenge the agreements we'd reached. After she left, Vivian lingered, an unreadable expression on her face. I may have overstepped with the kitchen reorganization, she admitted finally. It's just that when I visit my other daughter, Carol, she's always complaining that I interfere too much. With you, I felt useful. The admission surprised me. A glimpse of vulnerability from a woman who typically presented nothing but polished confidence. I appreciate your help, I said carefully. But perhaps in the future, we could discuss changes before implementing them? She nodded, a rueful smile briefly softening her features. Fair enough, and I'll see if I can find those mixing bowls in the donation box. They might not have been picked up yet. It was a small concession, but it felt meaningful. The beginning of a shift toward mutual respect rather than unilateral decision-making. As Vivian followed Natalie upstairs, Michael remained seated across from me. That went better than I expected, he observed. We'll see if the agreements hold, I replied, not wanting to be overly optimistic. Change takes time. I meant what I said, Mom, he assured me. About respecting your position here. I've been complacent, letting things slide because it was easier than confronting the tensions. That wasn't fair to you. I smiled, reaching over to squeeze his hand. One day at a time. That's all any of us can manage. Charlotte's cry from the baby monitor interrupted our moment of connection. Michael rose immediately. Following our family meeting, subtle shifts began to occur in our household. Michael made a visible effort to acknowledge my position, consulting me about household decisions and occasionally correcting Natalie when she overstepped. The transition wasn't seamless. Old habits resurfaced, tensions flared at times. But I could sense a gradual rebalancing of respect and consideration within our shared space. Vivian departed after another week, having retrieved my grandmother's mixing bowls from the donation pile and helped restore the kitchen to something closer to my original organization. Before leaving, she surprised me with an unexpected olive branch, a set of handcrafted ceramic garden markers for my herb beds. A small apology, she said, somewhat awkwardly. I admire how you've maintained this property all these years. It couldn't have been easy after losing Richard. The acknowledgement, however belated, touched me deeply. Thank you, I replied simply. The garden has been my solace. She nodded, a moment of genuine understanding passing between us. Natalie can be determined, she offered, choosing her words carefully. She's always had a clear vision of what she wants and how things should be. But she's also capable of growth, even if it doesn't always seem that way. I appreciated this glimpse of maternal insight, this attempt to bridge the divide between our perspectives. Charlotte is fortunate to have strong women in her life, I said, accepting the peace offering for what it was. After Vivian's departure, the process of reclaiming my master bedroom began in earnest. Years of marriage and motherhood had taught me to choose my battles wisely, and I approached this transition with strategic patience rather than confrontational demands. I selected a weekend when Natalie and Michael had planned an overnight trip to visit college friends, offering to care for Charlotte so they could enjoy adult time without worry. "Are you sure, Mom?" Michael asked when I suggested the arrangement. "It's a 2-hour drive each way, and we'd be gone overnight. That's a lot to ask." "Charlotte and I will be fine," I assured him. "We have our rhythm." The relief on his face was evident, a reminder that despite the tensions in our household, my support still represented a meaningful safety net for their family life. They departed early Saturday morning, leaving behind the usual litany of instructions about Charlotte's schedule, preferences, and current developmental phases, as if I hadn't been intimately involved in her care since birth. As soon as their car disappeared down the driveway, I set my plan in motion. With Charlotte happily occupied in her playpen, I began carefully packing Natalie's extensive collection of designer clothes, shoes, and accessories. I worked methodically, treating her belongings with the same respect I wished she had shown mine, folding everything properly, using tissue paper for delicate items, and labeling boxes clearly. By afternoon, I had emptied the walk-in closet that had once been mine, revealing the soft blue walls Richard and I had painted together when we first moved in. Charlotte had fallen asleep for her nap, giving me time to address the bathroom, removing Natalie's jungle of beauty products and restoring the simple, elegant arrangement I preferred. I didn't discard anything, merely relocated their possessions to the guest suite that would now become their bedroom. The work was physically demanding, but emotionally liberating. With each box I moved, each space I reclaimed, I felt a piece of myself returning. The woman who had built this life, maintained this home, and deserved to occupy its heart rather than its margins. By evening, the transformation was complete. I had moved my modest wardrobe back into the master closet, placed my books on the bedside table, and made up the bed with the hand-stitched quilt that had been a wedding gift from my grandmother. Charlotte had been my cheerful companion throughout, babbling happily from her portable playpen as I worked, occasionally looking up with such pure joy at the sight of me that my heart constricted with love for this innocent witness to my reclamation. I expected resistance upon their return the following day, perhaps anger from Natalie, discomfort from Michael, the tension of adjustment pulling at our recently established truce. What I didn't anticipate was the phone call that came late that night, just as Charlotte and I were settling into the rocking chair for her bedtime story. "Mom?" Michael's voice sounded strained. "Has anyone called you?" "No," I replied, immediately, alert to the tension in his tone. "What's wrong?" "There's been a fire at Melissa and David's place," he said, referring to the friends they were visiting. "Everyone's fine, but the whole street is being evacuated as a precaution. We're at a hotel about 20 miles from home, but all the roads back are closed because of the smoke." "Oh no," I said, genuinely concerned. "How can I help?" "We're okay for tonight, but they're saying it might be a day or two before they reopen the roads. Could you manage with Charlotte a bit longer than we planned?" "Of course," I assured him, glancing down at my granddaughter who was already dozing against my chest. "Take whatever time you need. We're absolutely fine here." The relief in his voice was palpable. "Thanks, Mom. We'll keep you posted." After hanging up, I sat in the rocking chair, Charlotte's warm weight against me, contemplating this unexpected extension of our time alone together. What had begun as a strategic weekend for rearranging bedrooms had become something more, a genuine opportunity to experience what life might be like if I reclaimed not just my physical space, but my autonomy within it. The next 2 days developed a peaceful rhythm of their own. Without Natalie's social calendar dictating our schedule or Michael's work calls punctuating our meals, Charlotte and I settled into a natural flow that honored both her needs and mine. We gardened in the cool mornings, her tiny hands patting soil around seedlings with more enthusiasm than precision. We walked to the library where my colleagues fussed over her while I selected new picture books for our afternoon reading sessions. We baked simple cookies, sang silly songs, and napped when tired rather than according to a rigid schedule. In tight, those quiet days, I rediscovered not just my home but myself, the woman who existed beyond the roles of mother, mother-in-law, and grandmother. I painted while Charlotte explored the texture of non-toxic modeling clay. I played my old vinyl records, dancing with her to Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong. I called friends I hadn't spoken to in months, scheduling lunch dates and gallery visits for the coming weeks. By the time Michael called to say they'd be returning the following afternoon, I had inhabited a version of my life that felt authentic and fulfilling in a way I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't that I didn't want my family around. I loved them deeply despite our complications, but rather that I'd remembered what it felt like to be the primary author of my own days, the respected steward of my own domain. When they finally arrived home, exhausted from the detour and the stress of the evacuation, I had dinner waiting. A simple, nourishing meal rather than the elaborate productions Natalie typically expected. Charlotte greeted them with delighted squeals, but then reached back for me when the excitement overwhelmed her. A small gesture that spoke volumes about the bond we'd strengthened during our time alone. "You've moved rooms," Natalie stated flatly as she carried her overnight bag upstairs, stopping abruptly at the threshold of what had been the master bedroom. Her tone wasn't accusatory, merely observational, perhaps too tired for confrontation. "Yes," I confirmed. "I've set up the East Suite for you both. Everything's there, organized as it was here." She looked at me for a long moment, then simply nodded and continued down the hall to what would now be their bedroom. No argument, no complaints, just silent acceptance that was, in its way, more significant than any verbal agreement could have been. Michael lingered in the kitchen after dinner, helping me with dishes while Natalie bathed Charlotte upstairs. "The room looks nice," he said carefully. "You've kept it the same as I remember from growing up." "With a few updates," I acknowledged. "But yes, the essentials remain." He dried a plate, setting it precisely in the cabinet. Natalie's being surprisingly accommodating about the switch. I smiled, handing him another dish. "Sometimes picking your battles is the wisest course. She's tired, and it's already done." "Still," he persisted, I expected more resistance. I considered this as I rinsed the last of the silverware. Perhaps she understands on some level that this is the right balance, that I've bent as far as I reasonably can. Michael was silent for a moment, then said quietly, "The fire at David and Melissa's, it made me think about what matters. If something happened to this house, what would we actually miss? Not the fancy bathroom fixtures or the perfect furniture arrangement, just the people, the memories." It was a moment of clarity I hadn't expected, my son recognizing, however briefly, the distinction between the material trappings of life and its essential substance. "That's usually how perspective arrives," I agreed, "through unexpected challenges." In the weeks that followed, our household settled into a new equilibrium. I had reclaimed my rightful place as the homeowner, while Michael and Natalie established their family unit within the boundaries we'd agreed upon. Charlotte bridged our separate spheres, equally comfortable in both worlds, bringing us together even when tensions lingered. Natalie, to her credit, adapted to the new arrangement with more grace than I had anticipated. Perhaps Vivian had spoken to her, or perhaps the reality of my resolve had finally registered. Whatever the reason, she began, tentatively at first, then with increasing consistency, to consult me about household matters that affected shared spaces. "Eleanor," she said one morning, using my name directly for perhaps the first time in months, "I was thinking of planting some hydrangeas along the east fence. Would that interfere with your garden plans?" The simple courtesy of asking rather than assuming felt like a significant breakthrough. Blue hydrangeas would complement the existing plantings, I replied, appreciating both her initiative and her consideration. I have some shade-loving perennials that would work well as underplantings, if you're interested. She seemed momentarily surprised by my constructive response, then nodded. I'd like that. Maybe you could show me where they'd work best. That afternoon, we spent an hour in the garden together, discussing soil conditions and color combinations, with a civility that occasionally verged on genuine connection. Charlotte toddled between us, delighted by the attention from both her mother and grandmother, unaware of the complex adult dynamics her presence was helping to heal. As summer transitioned into fall, Michael began keeping his promise about looking for their own home. Initially, I suspected the effort might be perfunctory, a token gesture to honor our agreement without genuine intent. But I underestimated the impact of our conversations and the subtle shifts in our family dynamic. We looked at a property in Oak Ridge yesterday, he mentioned casually over Sunday breakfast in late September. Nice yard, good school district, reasonable renovation potential. I glanced up from helping Charlotte with her oatmeal, careful to keep my expression neutral despite the flutter of mixed emotions his announcement triggered. Oak Ridge is lovely, close enough for regular visits, but with its own character. Natalie, surprisingly, was the one who added, "It needs work, but the bones are good." Reminds me a little of this place, actually. Solid craftsmanship beneath the outdated decor. High praise indeed, I observed with a small smile, recognizing her comment as both assessment and olive branch. They didn't make an offer on that particular house, but the mere fact that they were actively looking represented progress. Each weekend brought new property visits, new considerations, new possibilities discussed over dinner or during Charlotte's bath time. I offered opinions when asked, but otherwise maintained a supportive distance, understanding that this transition needed to unfold according to its own timeline. October brought Charlotte's first birthday, celebrated with a small gathering than the elaborate event Natalie had initially envisioned. The guest list included a few close friends, Vivian and Gerald, my sister Diane, who drove up from Arizona, and several of my library colleagues who had watched Charlotte grow through my stories and photos. The party itself was a blend of our different styles, Natalie's eye for detail evident in the tasteful decorations, my touch present in the homemade cake and traditional games. We had reached a peaceful collaboration that honored both our contributions without one overshadowing the other. As guests mingled in the living room after cake and presents, I overheard a conversation between Natalie and one of her friends from graduate school, the same woman who had once referred to me as the help. "Your mother-in-law is amazing," the friend was saying, watching as I helped Charlotte unwrap a gift. "The way she manages this beautiful historic home while still being so involved with Charlotte. You're lucky to have such family support." I expected Natalie to offer her usual dismissive response, some variation of the "she has nothing else to do" theme that had characterized her previous descriptions of my role. Instead, she surprised me. "We are lucky," she agreed, her voice carrying just enough for me to hear. "Eleanor has been incredibly generous, sharing her home with us while we find our footing as parents. And the house has been in her family for generations. She knows every inch of it, every story behind each room." The simple acknowledgement of my generosity, my ownership, my connection to the property's history felt like a watershed moment. Not an elaborate apology or dramatic reconciliation, but a quiet recognition of truth that had been lacking in our interactions for too long. Later that evening, as I was cleaning up the last of the party debris, Natalie joined me in the kitchen, taking a dish towel without being asked and drying the serving platters I'd just washed. "Thank you for today," she said after we'd worked in companionable silence for several minutes. "Charlotte loved every minute of it." "She's easy to celebrate," I replied honestly. "Such a joy." Natalie nodded, carefully polishing a crystal bowl that had been my mother's. "We made an offer on the Maple Street house," she said suddenly. The Victorian with the wraparound porch and the bay windows. I paused, my hands still in the soapy water. The one with the garden room at the back? Yes. Michael loves the built-in bookshelves in the study, and I can see Charlotte growing up there. Room for her to play, maybe for siblings eventually. She set the bowl down precisely on the counter. We should hear back by Tuesday. The news settled between us, significant but not unsettling, a natural progression rather than an abrupt rupture. It's a beautiful home, I said sincerely. Similar character to this one, but with its own personality. That's what we thought. She hesitated, then added, "It's only 15 minutes away. Close enough for regular visits, but your own space," I finished for her, as it should be. She looked at me directly then, something like respect in her expression. Yes, exactly. Their offer was accepted the following week, setting in motion the complex machinery of home, buying, inspections and financing, closing dates and moving plans. November brought a flurry of boxes and packing materials, decisions about what to take and what to leave behind, discussions about furniture and fixtures that now carried the weight of mutual respect rather than unilateral directives. Through it all, I maintained a supportive presence while creating healthy boundaries. I helped when asked, but didn't insert myself unnecessarily. I offered advice when solicited, but respected their autonomy in making decisions about their new home. It was a delicate balance, being available without being intrusive, supportive without being controlling. The moving date was set for mid-December, just before the holiday season would begin in earnest. As the day approached, I found myself experiencing a complex mixture of emotions: genuine happiness for their new beginning, natural sadness at the coming separation from daily life with Charlotte, and honest relief at the prospect of reclaiming my home entirely. The night before the move, after Charlotte had been put to bed amid boxes and partially dismantled furniture, Michael found me in the garden. Despite the winter chill, I had been sitting on the old iron bench, watching the stars emerge in the clear evening sky. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, offering a mug of steaming tea as he approached. I accepted both the tea and the company, shifting to make room for him on the bench. We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the familiar garden around us now dormant for winter, but still conveying the sense of continuity and renewal that had always been its gift. "Are you sad we're leaving?" Michael finally asked, his voice quiet in the stillness. I considered the question carefully. Not sad, exactly. I'll miss having Charlotte here every day, watching her discover new things, being part of her daily routine. But this is the natural order of things, isn't it? Children grow up, form their own families, create their own homes. He nodded, sipping his tea. We wouldn't have made it through this past year without you. Not just the practical help, but everything else, the stability, the wisdom, the patience. You would have managed, I assured him. Parents always do, one way or another. Maybe, he conceded, but not as well. Not with the same sense of being anchored to something larger than ourselves. He gestured toward the house, its windows, glowing warmly against the darkness. This place, your presence in it, it's given Charlotte a sense of heritage I never fully appreciated until I saw it through her eyes. The observation touched me deeply. My son recognizing the value of continuity and tradition that I had tried to preserve for him, now seeing it reflected in his own child. She'll still have that, I promised. Just in a different way. Weekend visits, holiday gatherings, summer afternoons in the garden. The connection remains, even when the daily proximity changes. I hope so, he said thoughtfully. I want her to know her roots, to understand where she comes from. She will, I assured him. As long as we all make the effort to nurture those connections. We fell silent again, finishing our tea as the evening deepened around us. Finally, Michael spoke once more, his voice now holding a note of careful consideration. "Mom, there's something Natalie and I have been discussing. We wanted to wait until things were more settled to bring it up." I turned to him, curious about his serious tone. "What is it?" "The guest house at the back of the new property. It's essentially a small cottage with its own entrance and garden area. It needs renovation, but structurally it's sound." He paused, seeming to choose his next words with care. "We were thinking, if you were ever interested in downsizing but wanted to remain close, it might be perfect once it's fixed up. Your own space, but near enough to be part of Charlotte's daily life." The offer caught me completely by surprise, not just its practical considerations, but the shift in perspective it represented. After months of tension over boundaries and ownership, they were now inviting me into their space, but on terms that preserved everyone's independence and dignity. "That's a generous thought," I said carefully. "But I'm not sure I'm ready to leave this home just yet. There are still too many memories here, too much of myself invested in these walls and gardens." "Of course," Michael replied quickly. "It was just an idea. Something to consider for the future, perhaps. No pressure or timeline." I reached over to squeeze his hand, genuinely touched by the gesture regardless of my answer. "Thank you for thinking of it. It means more than you know, that you'd want me nearby." The moving day itself passed in a whirlwind of activity. Professional movers handling the large furniture, friends and colleagues helping with smaller items, Natalie directing traffic with unexpected efficiency, while I kept Charlotte entertained away from the chaos. By late afternoon, the essential items had been transported to the new house, with plans for the remaining boxes to follow over the next few days. As twilight approached, Michael returned for a final load and to collect Natalie and Charlotte. The moment held a ceremonial quality, the formal transition from one chapter to the next. "We should get going if we want to be settled before Charlotte's bedtime," Natalie said, checking her watch. "The movers have already assembled her crib. At least." I nodded, helping Charlotte into her coat as Michael loaded the last few items into the car. The little girl looked up at me with her bright, trusting eyes, perhaps sensing the significance of the moment, even if she couldn't understand its details. "Gamma House?" she asked, using her name for me combined with her limited vocabulary. "This is Gamma's house," I confirmed gently. "And now you have your new house too. Both are places where people love you very much." She considered this solemnly, then broke into a wide smile. "Visit soon?" "Very soon," I promised, bending to kiss her forehead. "Tomorrow, in fact." Satisfied with this assurance, she allowed Natalie to buckle her into the car seat without protest. Michael closed the trunk and turned to me, hesitating before pulling me into an unexpected hug. "It feels strange," he admitted quietly. "Leaving home again after all this time." "But you're not really leaving," I reminded him. "Just changing locations. Home is a feeling as much as a place, Michael. You carry it with you." He smiled, his expression a mixture of nostalgia and anticipation. "When did you get so wise?" "Around the time I stopped letting people treat me like the cleaning lady," I replied with gentle humor. His smile turned rueful at the reminder of how far we'd all come. "Fair enough. See you tomorrow for dinner? We should have the kitchen unpacked by then." "I'll bring dessert," I promised. After final hugs and goodbyes, I stood in the driveway, watching their car disappear down the street, Charlotte's small hand waving from the back window until they turned the corner. Then slowly I walked back into my home, fully and completely mine again for the first time in over a year. The silence struck me first. Not an empty silence, but a peaceful one, full of possibility rather than absence. I moved through the rooms, noting the shadows of where their possessions had been, the small marks of their temporary residence already fading as the house seemed to exhale around me. In the living room, I settled into Richard's old chair, now returned to its proper place by the window overlooking the garden. The familiar contours embraced me as I gazed at the twilight landscape outside. Dormant now, but holding within it all the promise of spring's eventual return. Tomorrow would bring a new rhythm, visits and phone calls rather than shared meals, and daily routines. Charlotte would have 2 homes now, 2 centers of security and love. Michael and Natalie would establish their own traditions, their own patterns of family life, and I would reclaim the full measure of my independence while maintaining the connections that mattered most. But tonight, in the gentle quiet of a house that had sheltered 4 generations of my family, I allowed myself to simply be present, neither defined by others' perceptions, nor confined by their expectations. Just Eleanor Matthews, herself complete, in a home that had always known exactly who she was. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.